Financial transparency, one of the big issues that's facing Southern Baptists right now, and some of the steps that are being taken for or against it. What was approved or not approved at the executive committee meeting, which was just held in Nashville, Tennessee. That's going to be our topic today as we look at exactly what's happening with financial transparency and other issues in the Southern Baptist Convention. Hi, I'm Bobby Gilstrap, and today I have joining me John Batts, who is one of the executive committee members for the executive committee of the Southern Baptist Convention. He's a representative out of the Northwest Baptist Convention, and so we're glad to have him joining us today. John, we're glad to have you joining us, and we're so glad to be able to have you being a part of this podcast, but to give us kind of a firsthand update on some of the things that are happening in the Southern Baptist Convention. This executive committee meeting, which just transpired and just finished yesterday, there were a number of things that took place, and some of great consequence, because this was the meeting where some of the motions that were made in last year's annual meeting were brought before the executive committee for their deposition. That's not the right word, is it? To be deposed of, one way or the other.
Yeah, for sure.
So, John, we're glad to have you joining us today.
Yeah, thanks very much for the invite. Appreciate it. Glad to be here, and glad to help in any way that I can.
Well, one of the frustrations, I think, for those of us who are kind of just sitting in the local church is when we see motions brought to the floor in the Southern Baptist Convention. For those of us who've been around for a long time, many times we look at it and go, okay, that'll not make it. That won't make it. That won't make it. And we start going, okay, they're going to refer that. They're going to, get rid of that. They're going to say that's out of order, because it seems like the platform, to some observers, they would say it appears they're manipulating everything and whatever. I understand, having been around long enough and having a little background in parliamentary procedure, not a lot, but some, far from an expert, but that a lot of that does come up with parliamentary procedure. Certain things have to be followed. There's the relationship between the different entities and how that's set up corporately, all that kind of thing. But it's really frustrating for those sitting in the annual meeting, in the pew as such, at an annual meeting, to try to get something accomplished. And it seems like it doesn't matter how we word it, doesn't matter how it's phrased, it doesn't matter when it comes, doesn't matter whether it's a motion, a resolution, whatever it is, it gets kicked off to the side. So maybe you can help give us some insight a little bit on that. The big issue that there's several big issues Southern Baptists are dealing with, but one of the big issues is the issue of financial transparency. And I want us to look at that and talk about that. And at the end of our time together, I'm going to make sure that folks have the ability to be able to make contact with the executive committee and be able to write them. And I'm going to give you the contact information to be able to do that. But let's start off, John. Can you, having just come out of that meeting, kind of give us a short synopsis of kind of where we are? I mean, where do we need to be looking? And from our perspective, just sitting back observing, we just want to talk about what steps maybe we need to take or what we need to be looking for.
Sure. Well, there's a lot there. Let's see if we can unpack a little bit of it. And I'm certainly not one to be a parliamentarian expert, but I would share your sentiment that there's definitely, having just experienced last summer, the annual meeting down in New Orleans, and being on the floor and knowing how things often get referred in the executive committee. I fully understand the pain that people experience in the seats, and I don't think I've gotten quite adept to be able to know, yep, that one's not going to make it, or like you mentioned, some folks that have been around maybe a little longer than I have, but I do know that there's definitely some concerns that are there. I would say this before we dive into the specifics from the EC meeting, just some things that I've learned, and these may not be valuable, I don't know, but I'll share them with you anyway. I will say that generally speaking, we we end up, as a Southern Baptist convention, when we meet, in fact, one of the things that the committee that I was on just took up during our last meeting was approving the contract for the parliamentarian. So there is a contract. We hire a parliamentarian to serve as chief parliamentarian for the convention meeting, and that person has to serve every time that there's business being done. That person is serving and providing input and has to be an expert on Robert's Rules of Order and such. So a lot of times the way that things get routed is, are really specifically directed by Robert's Rules of Order. And because we have in our official documentation that all the business is conducted according to Robert's Rules of Order, then, if we don't follow those things, then decisions could be rendered null and void, so to speak, because, you didn't follow procedure, so it doesn't count. So
Right.
there
Well,
are
and I think most folks understand the complexity of Robert's Rules of Order. I mean, it's like hundreds and hundreds of pages. Most,
I
most
know,
churches don't actually follow,
no.
we need a Robert's Rules of Order for Dummies, whatever. I
Top 10
usually,
list.
well, I was going to say the church where I'm transitional pastor right now, I basically, our chairman of deacons moderates. And so I basically have just sat down and gone, okay, here are the basics. Here just, when a committee reports and this is
Yes, sir.
because there's no way you can handle it. But in a setting like the annual meeting where there are thousands and thousands of people, it would just be mass chaos to handle it like it is a local church. So I think everybody gets that. But the frustration is, for instance, we want to talk about the transparency deal. So let's go ahead and jump into that.
You bet.
When it comes to the issue of transparency, particularly of our entities, there's been so much that's been said in the last 3, 4, 5 years, particularly, and even further back as things started kind of surfacing with the McRaney North American Mission Board lawsuit, and things were being revealed that were happening. There have been multiple efforts by messengers to put on the floor a motion that could be voted on by the messengers to get more transparency, to get salary structures, to find out exactly where funds are being spent, how funds are being spent, that kind of thing. And this particular convention, this last convention that we had, there were two motions that were brought forth that you guys dealt with in the EC meeting this time that dealt with trying to get at least the minimum transparency that you would get in the Form 990 the IRS requires of other, nonprofits groups. For instance, the Planned Parenthood is far more transparent than what our Southern Baptist entities are. And some look at that and go, oh, my soul, you've got to be kidding. You mean that those who give to Planned Parenthood know more about where their gift is going and how it's being used than we know about our mission dollars that people have sacrificed to give? So the one of those that was brought forth was this particular issue that was brought before the committee, and the committee formally opted to defer to June an official vote on reporting by the entities of information contained in the Form 990. And that was the request in the motion. We're not going to go into the wording and all the details of the motion, but basically the motion was, can't we at least get the minimum requirement that the IRS requires of nonprofits on the Form 990? Can't we at least find out that much as Southern Baptist from our entities? So the EC, that committee, opted to defer this, delay this up until the June meeting to vote on it, which basically means that there was no discussion entertained and no movement as far as this, even though my understanding is there was quite a bit of opposition to this kind of transparency from our entity leaders. What kind of insight can you give us?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking about that, Bobby. So I wasn't in the committee meeting because the committee that I'm on met at exactly the same time as that one did. So I wasn't able to be at the meeting when that was being discussed. But what I can tell you is that, at least from what I've heard, that the biggest reason why they opted to move it to June was to make sure that they could provide as thorough a response as possible. So that if in fact that if it's yes, let's recommend it and move forward, okay, great. Then that's terrific. Or if it's a no, we recommend that it doesn't move forward. But either way, here are some places that you can go. One of the things that I shared with some of the executive leadership on the EC was that there are claims that there are procedures that are in place for all of the entities that can be followed by any messenger. And if you follow those procedures and formally request to get information, then they're ready and willing to provide that information following the procedure. And so one of the things that I share with the executive leadership was like, the biggest issue right now is that, I mean, I've been a pastor for over 24 years. I've been serving on the EC, I mean, it's my first term, but it's coming to, the term's coming to a close. And, I've been on it for 3 years or so, and I was supposed to be on in 2020, by the way, but since we didn't have an annual meeting, my first term cut short. But in any case, there's literally no place that is available online to be able to go and find whatever those supposed procedures are. So that was kind of a thing for me. There are claims that 80% of the information or more that people are looking for that are typically contained in the 990, are already available in the annual financial reports and the book of reports and such. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. But the issue is those things are buried and people just simply don't know where to go. And it's not just just a small group of people that are talking heads or wanting to just rush to tweet about things for their own, for their own glory. These are really highly intelligent people who love the SBC and love SBC life and want to see things thrive in the SBC and are deeply concerned about some things that are going on. And the fact that there is this supposed wall that exists, when people have even made requests from the floor. I shared a video clip, that little short video clip that I think I don't remember if it was Dr. McCraney that forwarded on to me, but it was just the clip from one of the annual meetings recently from the floor, where there was literally requests saying, will you share the information? And even then, the question literally wasn't answered. It was just danced around, and that was the end of that. So there's definitely a wall that's there for whatever reason. And so, the example that I gave was, because I'm bivocational, I work in a corporate environment, and in the company I work for, we have kind of a standing rule that if you're going to bring a concern to the table, some kind of a complaint or some kind of an issue, then you can't just vomit on the table and then walk away and let somebody else clean it up. You've got to at least come with some kind of a proposed solution. And I said, I told the executive leadership, I said, look, in the end, as an executive committee, as trustees, literally by definition, we have been entrusted with the motions that have been referred to our various committees. And we need to be good stewards over those motions that are entrusted to us, so that if in fact we determine, either because of the way the motion's read or because of some legal reason, or because something is deemed out of order from Robert's rule, whatever, who knows what, if we determine that something isn't going to pass through committee, is going to be declined or whatever, then to be fair and as a good steward of the motion that's been entrusted to us, we should provide more background and then even go so far as to provide a way for the person who made the motion to get close to obtaining what they're looking for, if that's even possible. Provide them, like, this doesn't work, but you could do it this way, or we can't do it this way through a motion. However, you can go here and here and here, and here are the links, and here are the specific people to contact in order to get the information that you're looking for. And we've already reached out to them, and they've already told us verbally that they're, willing and ready to help, or whatever the case may be. There just needs to be more of a cooperative arrangement between the messengers, who are typically the ones that are representing the sole member of the entities, and and how we're handling them, rather than just kind of stiff arming and saying, no, we're not doing that, next. Instead, we need to say, no, we're not doing that, however, or yes, we can do that, but if you need the information sooner, then you can do this, or or whatever the case may be. And I
Well,
think that
and
there was a receptiveness to that message, I think, and I believe that that's a direction that they want to take, to make sure that, because they recognize that. I mean, honestly, just as a case in point with the bylaws, the only entity that has bylaws that is, that are available to review is the executive committee. You can't, if you try to find the bylaws for NAM, you're not going to find them. Try to find the bylaws for the IMB, not going to find them. You're not going to look. I mean, I even went so far as to look at the Secretary of State's website in Georgia for NAM, and I got the articles of incorporation, but no bylaws. So just even that level to find out what are the operating documents. There should be a lot more transparency, in my opinion. Of course, each entity is able to operate on its own and decide, by its own trustees and its own operating documents, what they decide to make available or not. But regardless, there definitely needs to be more transparency, and I fully agree with that.
well, from the perspective sitting, in the auditorium, basically when we're having an annual meeting, the appearance is that the platform is managing and manipulating. And again, as I mentioned a moment ago, I understand parliamentary procedure and there are certain things that have to be done. But the sense is there's a squashing, there's a moving on, there's an ignoring certain microphones. There's, I mean, there's just things that happen there that give the appearance of that. And I realize, if there are, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, 15,000 people in a room, it's just going to be impossible for everything to be clear,
Right.
and even when you cut off, discussion of something, somebody's going to be standing there wanting to say something. And I understand that. But the reality is, since we shorten the total time for the annual meeting, it seems to be even magnified the fact that there's just not much business time. We have a lot of singing, we have preaching, we have this, that, and the other. And then when it comes to the actual business, and this is the only business opportunity that messengers have, when it comes to the actual business, it's cut short. It's minimized. Now, I understand this time around that we've extended one session to add to that a little bit. It's not a full day like, before we had longer, I guess at one time we had 3.5 days, if I remember right. It's been a long time ago, but anyway, and that's a step in the right direction to add a little bit of time to the overall time. But the transparency issue just gets magnified with the finances, and talk just a little bit about this particular issue with the 990. Exactly what is potentially going to be the next step in trying to get that level of financial transparency, because this effort's been made several times. So can you give us any kind of, just in a capsule, kind of what you think the future forecast is going to be?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I don't know which way the committee is going to go on, whether they're going to vote in affirmation or decide to decline it. But what I will say is that in speaking with, in speaking with some folks in executive leadership, there's definitely a clear interest in making sure that that the avenues that people need to take in order to get the information that they're looking for are more readily available, and that information at minimum will come out of committee. I was disappointed, to be fair, that there wasn't a vote that was made or a recommendation, and that there wasn't any discussion, because I mean, even as trustees for the EC, I mean, we only get together 3 times a year, unless there's extenuating circumstances. But we get together in September and in February, and then literally, for a short meeting the day before the annual convention begins. And so, we don't really have a lot of opportunity to sit together in the same room, deliberate for as long as it takes about various issues. And to defer to the June meeting was disappointing, to be sure. But I do, at least if I give, the benefit of the doubt for those that are there, I do trust the gentleman who's head of that committee. And, I trust that, from the executive leadership, the words that I've gotten, that they're going to try to, make some things that are, seem to be buried, bring them up to light so that they're quite a bit more readily available. And hopefully that will at least be a step in the right direction. And we'll see. we'll see what the ultimate outcome is. But I certainly agree 100%. There needs to be better transparency within the SBC as a whole. It is a travesty that it's been so difficult to get really basic information in order to understand things. And whether it's to hold organizations accountable for the things that they're doing, or whether it's just, look, I'd like to know exactly how the money that I'm giving or that our church is giving sacrificially is being invested in the kingdom. It really doesn't matter what the motive is behind the request. In the end, the messengers comprise the SBC, and if the messengers ask for it, the messengers should get it. And and that's just the way it is. And at least according to Articles of Incorporation, the sole member of NAM is the SBC. So that means that the messengers should be able to get what they're looking for, and likewise with any other entity, right? So I agree with you. There definitely needs to be more transparency.
Well, on the issue of finances, let's look at another thing that kind of surfaced from the executive committee meeting. The SBC Cooperative Program Allocation Budget Annual Report showed a shortfall exceeding 3.5%, with the most noteworthy changes being over the Cooperative Program general budget, which was short over $8.6 million. Lottie Moon was also short over $6 million, so we're down overall receipts by nearly $14.6 million. That is a significant amount at that point. What was the discussion around this? How is this going to be resolved? I mean, we know, at least in part, anecdotal evidence is that a number of churches are stopping to give, if not totally withdrawing and leaving the convention. There's been seemingly a large number of those, but again, that's anecdotal on my part. I haven't seen the actual numbers. Maybe you have seen the actual numbers of churches lost, but at least there's been some withholding. And many state conventions now, because of this lack of transparency and people being just irate over particularly two of our entities, the ERLC and then North American Mission Board, some of the things that have happened there and the lack of transparency, they've said, hey, we don't want to support those. And then, of course, a couple of the seminaries, there have been some issues too. But many of the state conventions now are saying, hey, look, you can restrict your cooperative program gifts. Send us your check, which is basically how the money's funneled through the state convention. And they say you can restrict that. So send us your cooperative program dollars, and you can say, but we don't want any of our money going to A, B, or C entity. So how are we discussing resolving this issue at the executive committee level?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would say that, when the hardest questions that came out of the discussion on the budget were, really understanding, why the shortfall existed, and what some of the steps were that we're taking now to make sure that we're operating on a proper budget that's properly allocated. There wasn't a whole lot of discussion about steps that we can take in order to remedy the situation. I will say that you're certainly right. There are quite a number of churches that and state conventions that are either directly allocating funds or where money is staying local, and that's the big focus. And people that are saying, no, don't send it here. We don't want it to support here. Some people have heard of escrowing funds, where they're giving, they're setting it aside, but they're not releasing it until things are addressed. So, to that extent, those things are handled typically at an entity level. Whatever one is the biggest concern. So, or ones, whichever ones are the biggest concern. So I think my biggest advice would be to those who are listening in, who are uniquely concerned about it, would be, be persistent and communicate directly with the entity. If there are procedures that are that are made available, as have been hinted at, that in order to get information that's needed, then I'll be the first one to tweet it out, to be able to share that with you, and I'll share that with you specifically, Bobby, so you can share it with your audience, and make sure that everyone who is concerned has the right avenues that they can reach out to in order to get the information that they're looking for. And then, at that point, then the ball is in the court of the various entities, right? And if there's a procedure in place and that's what they want us to follow, and we follow it, and then they still choose to not give the information, well, that's a different story. Right now, if they're able to hide behind, well, the procedure's not being followed, well, okay, then let's know what the procedure is. We'll follow the procedure, and we'll play that process out and see how it goes. So I think that's the biggest thing. There were some changes to the way that there were some concerns, I guess, that were expressed during the meeting about the way the budget had been handled previously, and why there were some significant shortfalls, especially in CP allocations and for the executive committee for its budget, and the SBC budget, operating budget as a whole. And there are some steps that are being taken that will be reflected in next year's budget, the next fiscal year's budget, that will show that how things are being looked at more, I would say, more transparently and more realistically, so that the things that are actually in the operating budget are not just because it's been that way forever, but literally it's reflective of exactly where we are. We do have some concerns.
Yeah, but John, let me just ask, getting down to the brass tacks, why are we over budget by that much? I mean, that's huge. That's enormous. So what was the justification? What was the reasoning behind why in the world we have overspent so much and it's not been anticipated in the budget? And I understand a budget's a guideline we're trying to anticipate, and sometimes things arise that are unanticipated. But what was the justification? What have they explained to you guys as an executive committee?
Well, yeah. So let's be clear, right? So that report, like the one that showed the $14.6 million difference, right? That wasn't a how much did we spend versus how much did we take in. That was how much did we take in compared to how much did we take in the previous year, right? So so we did have a pretty solid year, one of our largest years of general cooperative program giving in 2021-22. At that year, the CP allocation budget receipts were over 200 million. So it dropped to 191.8 and a half, almost 192 million for the last fiscal year.
So basically kind of flat year over year.
Well, it's about, it was a drop of 4%, so 4.3%, year over year. It's still a drop, and it's significant. I mean, it's not, we're not talking about pizzas, we're talking about lives. And, $8 million is a lot of dollars, right? For
Absolutely.
Operating expenses and for missionary work and all of that stuff. So it is a lot, and certainly there are some concerns, and it is also concerning that the proposed budget for for the next, the next fiscal year, is down at even less, right? I think that motion was at 190 million. I'm looking through my notes. Sorry, at the moment.
Okay, no, that's all right.
Yeah, I think that was the motion that came out of committee. For the 24-25 proposed SBC Cooperative Program allocation budget, down at 190,250,000. We didn't get into what the reasoning was behind that and what that expectation was, although they were noticing that there were trends and lower giving. And I honestly didn't get the feel like they really knew exactly all the mitigating factors behind that. I suspect that there's probably some assumptions that there's inflationary pressures that are holding people back from being able to give, but there are also, as you mentioned, those churches and state conventions that are intentionally withholding funds or escrowing them, waiting for things to get more transparent. So
well, and even the annual meeting last year was overspent by what, $500,000?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, what was the explanation for that?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that could be offered was that our current CFO is not the CFO who was there at the time that the budget was prepared for covering last year's annual meeting expenses, and he flat out said, to be honest, I don't know why they budgeted what they budgeted amount, because it's not realistic, and the good point is that we've had quite a bit more people who have started to show up we've had a number of years where the number of messengers was quite light. 6 to 8,000 was kind of the running average, and then all of a sudden it's jumped up to nearly twice that. And get 12 to 15,000 people that are showing up. Even had a strong showing all the way out on the west in Anaheim. So when you think about the accounting for all of those numbers of people, it just and honestly, the big convention centers are more expensive than what we had budgeted. So so there definitely is that, and I would say it's much better represented in the budget moving forward.
Okay. Also in the 22-20 or the 22 through 33, the EC, or 23, I guess it is, EC and SBC operating budget annual report, under budgeted for the SBC annual meeting. I just mentioned that.
Yep.
But there was a large discrepancy with convention communications of nearly $400,000, and the general and administrative line item under budgeted for over $800,000.
Right.
Any explanation for some of these things? That seems to be pretty
Sure.
significant.
Yeah,
Misunderstanding or
significant.
misrepresentation. Yeah.
Yeah, it was significant. And honestly, there wasn't really a great explanation for the convention communication stuff. I think that was something they're going to look into and figure out exactly, what was budgeted and why that was so far, out of whack. I will say that for the general and administrative line item for the 22-23 operating budget line, included in that number was the reasonably significant number that was set aside for the basically guidepost indemnification. So one of the key things that was part of the agreement, when the messengers directed the EC to do to have the independent study done, and and Guideposts was the organization. Part of that was, look, if we're named in a lawsuit, then there's got to, because of the outcome of what you've asked us to do, then there's got to be some indemnification that's there. And and that's just that's kind of normal contractual language. And of course, if you followed anything in the fallout from that report, there have been a number of lawsuits that have happened that have come out of that, and in those lawsuits, occasionally Guidepost is mentioned. So when for any legal expenses that are related to that, then that was rolled into that line item. It's now separated out into a legal / Guidepost line item for the 24-25 budget, and so it'll be better reflected there to know exactly what those expenses are. And the general just day-to-day legal expenses that are just that are always there for the for any entity like the executive committee, that will be down into that general and administrative section. So there was a request that was put onto the floor that when that information gets released, that discrepancy is explained better, so that anybody who happens to have a numbers kind of mind or an accounting mind could better understand, well, hey, what gives? Why are those numbers kind of off, and why do we change the name of that line item? And if you're into accounting, like, hey, wait a second, that doesn't work quite so well. So yeah.
Sure. Well, and you bring up a great topic that I wanted to ask about anyway, and that's the multitude of lawsuits. What kind of or how was that addressed there? I know we've got some of the abuse lawsuits that have now started multiplying greatly. There has been a real sense of, particularly with the North American Mission Board and their court filings, a connectionalism of Southern Baptists, putting us all together like we're all one big church, even using that phraseology. They've used the phrase, the Baptist Church, the Southern Baptist Church, which obviously we're not. There is no such thing as the Baptist Church or the Southern Baptist Church, but that's the language they've used in the court. The assumption is to infer that we're all one entity because they're trying to find protection. But the problem is that started linking everything together. That started connecting in the court documents that, hey, look, we all are connected. And then the abuse situations, they're looking at how many levels can we actually sue and where can the money come from and all that kind of thing. So what kind of justification, that's not the right word, explanation, what kind of explanation was maybe given about all these lawsuits that are starting to surface? And I'm sure that's been an impact on the financial picture this last year as well.
It is, it is definitely a concern, out of all fairness, if you look at the way that the executive committee has to handle the additional legal expenses that are related to any of the lawsuits that are coming out, then, those additional legal expenses are coming primarily from the reserves that the EC has built up. And, and in all honesty, it's expensive. Having attorneys that are retained in order to deal with those things and deal with them properly in a way that is hopefully honoring to God and to the parties that involved, but also protective of the SBC, as they should be. That's what they're hired to do. That's just, it's not inexpensive to do that. And there have been lawsuits that have come out that that have specifically followed the guidepost report, and that have come out as a result of that. The silver lining of the cloud, I guess, is that most of that there seems to be a downward trend in the lawsuits that have been filed, and there's been some positive developments that have happened, with regards to that. But I would say overall, it's still a very, very significant thing. And, and the EC is doing what we can in order to make sure that we're being as supportive as we can, but also, trying to recognize that it's expensive, so, dealing with the very, very real reality of, how long is this going to go, and what should we be planning for? And that's something that the trustees are definitely wrestling with.
Okay, so from my perspective, I'm hearing what you're saying, and I'm thinking, okay, understand some of this is unanticipated, but you mentioned it's draining our reserves, et cetera, from a business financial standpoint. You've got to look at it, ABC 1, 2, 3, and go, okay, that's a huge deal. You have reserves for a reason,
That's right.
for an emergency. Okay, so what are we doing? What do you see, or what was discussed as the potential of making adequate adjustments to our cooperative program allocations, or whatever, that could give us the ability to start rebuilding these reserves and putting that back in the proper place, as well as handle the current financial impact of all these other things that are happening?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And to be honest, I would say at this point, there doesn't seem to be a huge sense of urgency to begin building back those reserves just
Oh,
yet.
man.
And so that was a concern. In fact, that's one that I voiced on the floor when we were looking at the budget. Oh, I went sideways.
You did. What
I don't
happened
know
to you
why.
there?
I have no idea.
Well, wiggle your
Let me,
camera there a little bit, see if
yep.
we can straighten you back up.
Well, how about that? That's kind of funny. Does
Well,
that make any
yeah,
difference?
that gets you back straight. But I
Okay,
don't.
well, there we go.
Oh, there you
That
go.
was
Okay.
that was funny. Sorry
Well,
about that.
we don't want to
So
put you full screen looking like that, do we?
no, 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 that'd be fun.
Okay, okay.
So
And
so
that
so
was the
so
devil trying to get us off track
I
of our
know.
topic.
I know, totally, totally. So funny. Technology's
Okay.
great, isn't it?
Yeah,
But so
yeah.
I would say this, I think that, one of the things that has historically been done, when the executive committee, one of our primary responsibilities, and this was explained to me prior to all the sex abuse issues that have come up, really starting with my term. And I mean, so it's been tough the whole time that I've been there. But I would say that, one of our biggest responsibilities is handling all the cooperative program dollars and making sure that they get allocated properly. And the percentage of distribution, which entity gets what distribution percentage, those things are formulas that have been followed for a really long time. And if you start messing around with those formulas, then obviously then people are like, wait a second, I'm not getting as much money as I thought that I was going to get from the cooperative program, and and that impacts how we do our business and such. But if you look at the proposed budget, and looking at the what executive committee and SBC operating budget proposed for 24-25 that was listed as one of the motions that was discussed, there's a, they're planning for a shortfall of a little over $1.6 million. And the reality is that that takes very little. There's very little give that would be needed from each of the recipients of cooperative program dollars in order to really make up that shortfall and at least bring it to zero. I mean, you're looking at like a 0.88% or something like that. I mean, it's not even a 1% difference in what they would normally get. And I'm not talking like if they get 3.9% to go to 2.9%. I'm talking if they get 3.9%, then instead they get 3.82% or something. I mean, it's an itty bitty amount, right? That they would be,
well, on a percentage basis, I understand it's an itty bitty amount, but
yep,
because we're talking about millions and millions of dollars,
understood.
The dollar amount seems to be rather large. But just take, for instance, real quick, and I know we're running a little long here, but take, for instance, our seminaries. Our seminaries, they do a phenomenal job raising money, foundations money, and all
Yep.
kinds of other things where they have money put together for scholarships and all kinds of other things at that point. And if I remember right from what I saw a while back, the total percentage of operating budget for most of our seminaries is rather small. It's not even half of their total operating budget because of the money coming somewhere else. So why do you think that they would not be willing to surrender, say, 1% or whatever of the total allocation to be able to help rebuild reserves, help the cooperative program dollars get back on track in budget and all that kind of thing? Was there some explanation given?
Yeah, I would say this. I don't want to give a false narrative around seminaries. I don't know that they were asked, to be honest. I'm not part of the finance
Okay.
committee, so what I got was a general feel like we're just going to stick with our normal allocation percentage for now and deal with it in the subsequent year. I just disagree personally with that. But
Yeah.
yeah, because I think there's several trustees that feel the same way. Like, look, I know it's going to be a little painful, but better to be a little painful now than be a lot painful later. And let's
Yeah.
go ahead and be prudent with finances, because I mean, and I think all the listeners would know flat out. I mean, they would know firsthand that the number one topic that gets contentious at a church is financial. I mean, anything to do with finances
Absolutely.
that gets, and understandably, right? Because people are giving their money to the church in order to do whatever ministries, and they want to know that it's being invested wisely. They're trusting that that's happening properly. And likewise, when you're talking about something at the scale of 190 $200 million, I mean, that's a lot of money. And and recognizing that's that's an issue, then okay, I mean, that's it's a lot. So
Right.
so I certainly understand, and I think there's some anticipated, probably some difficult conversations that would likely come up when they start going down that road. Say, hey, we need to start tweaking the allocation percentages. But nonetheless, I think that that's something we need to do sooner than later. And I plan to continue to having conversation with some of the folks that are part of the EC to say, hey, I'd like to maybe consider rethinking this if we can, and and see how we can go. Yeah.
Well, look, let's wrap up with this as we're kind of trying to wrap up our time.
Yes, sir.
Talk to us a little bit about the establishment here of the ARC by the ARITF.
Okay.
Not time to go into a lot of depth, but
Yep.
this has, well, in fact, when I did a quick search late last night, early this morning, actually, not good. But
Yeah.
anyway, when I was doing a search of kind of reporting and that kind of thing, most of the things we've discussed about shortfalls and budget and all that other kind of stuff, that's not being reported. The things that Washington Post and Christian Post and all these other entities that report religion news and all this stuff, they're reporting on this issue.
Sure.
Obviously, because of the abuse issue. And I understand that. That's a huge deal. Even though I think many of our people in our churches are a little confused at why the convention, the umbrella, that we all connect with cooperatively
Yes, sir.
being made quote unquote responsible for, financially, following through or even maintaining the website. A lot of people are confused about why would we do that? That's a legal thing that, should be done locally or whatever. Let's don't get into all that. But
Yep.
you know what I'm saying is there's a
I
lot
do.
of confusion around that. And all of the secular reporting is about the abuse issue because
Yep.
the thinking is we're a denomination just like, the Methodist Church, Catholic Church, with all
Sure.
the abuse issues that happen there, and that every entity needs to be connected and responsible for whatever happens in a local church. So there's some steps being taken where they've created this art. Give us a nutshell. Help us understand what in the world is going on with that and why that's being done. Is it a plus or a minus in your view?
Sure. So ARITF, they're in their second year now, and they have a mandate from the messengers that there are some things that need to be taken care of, including.
And for those who are unfamiliar, tell us what the ARITF stands for.
Yeah, so the Abuse Reform Implementation Task Force.
There we go. Okay,
it was
just so people know. Yeah.
Yeah. It used to be the Sexual Abuse Task Force,
Right.
when we were first doing that investigation. But now that the investigation has happened, and it's like, okay, well, what reform measures do we need to start putting into place that can
Right.
assist our churches in dealing with the possibility of this? One of
Right.
the
Okay. So now set up the ARC.
Okay.
What's going on with this ARC, which stands for?
Yeah, for sure. So some of the former members of ARITF, as well as current members of ARITF, have taken it upon themselves to proceed with, and it's not firmly in place yet, but this is I think there'll be more that will be in place and more firmly set up. At least that's the goal by time for the annual meeting. And so there'll be a presentation at the annual meeting where some information will be shared. But but the former members and some of the former members and some current members of ARTF have taken it upon themselves to form a 501c3 independent nonprofit organization that is responsible for handling the kind of resourcing, as well as having a permanent house for any kind of a database that churches could use in order to run people in ministry through it as kind of a background check almost, and make sure
So the
that
idea is this is going to be funded through Cooperative Program dollars. I mean, you're
Yeah,
saying
so
it's
that
being set up as a nonprofit, so not trying to set up another entity among Southern Baptists, but
no, not trying to set up another entity. And they've made it clear that they are going to need some money in order to get started, and where that money comes from will not necessarily be through the cooperative program. Maybe there were some monies that were set aside for for handling the needs that that the messengers dictated to ARITF, and so there's a possibility that some of those funds may be allocated to help get at least get the database up and running and get that process started. I don't know. They're still working out the details. So, they had to be intentionally light on exactly how that level of things would function. But when they first announced that there was going to be a separate entity, honestly, my concern flags went up. I'm like, wait a second, then how does that work? If the SBC doesn't have any direct oversight over that process, then how is it going to work? And is it possible that there could be that it could, at some point in time be structured in a way that wouldn't necessarily be in line with Baptist polity, or, they might have people, that are serving on a governing board who, for instance, aren't followers of Jesus, or whatever. And so, that was a concern that I had initially. But one of the things that was brought up, and that I didn't honestly know, I probably should have, but I didn't know, but there are some, several of the seminaries that are part of the SBC now that were started separately and independently. I think disaster relief was started independently by Southern Baptists who just had a passion for that ministry and said, we're going to start this. And they formed their own thing. And then eventually it kind of falls under the, that the SBC forms a more direct cooperative arrangement with that particular ministry. But at its beginning, it wasn't that way. So, I think jury's still out about, how that will all function. But I think the goal was, how do we have a safe place for the database and for dedicated a dedicated efforts to make sure that that gets maintained, because I mean, it's only as good as the data in it. So it has to be maintained on a regular basis. So where can that be housed? Where can that be kept? And then how do we do so in a way that that doesn't inadvertently cause any backlash to the SBC? So, so that was, so that's kind of the big deal. And, obviously with everything in the litigious society that we're in, we want to make sure that that is all, that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, so to speak. So that's been a real big focus for
you
them.
have
Yeah.
you have a pretty good feel that that's kind of going in the right direction. I mean,
I think so for now. It seems like the people who, I mean, they have a pretty broad spectrum of people who are currently serving on the ARITF, and, people that, that have a multitude of opinions, but they seem to be pretty united around us. And they've got some really good legal advice. They've had really good conversations with the SBC leadership and with entity leadership as well. And a lot of conversations. It's taken hundreds of hours to get to the point where they are. And I think that's important, for any, for the listeners to understand that anytime that the messengers say, go do this, have the president appoint a committee to do this, whatever that is, typically that's made up of volunteers, and those volunteers will then subsequently give, honestly, dozens and sometimes hundreds of hours in order to fulfill that on a volunteer basis, on top of whatever they're doing at a local church level. And if they have a job, trying to balance all of that, in a family and trying to balance all that. So I will tell you that the ARITF members in the past and present are very engaged on the topic, and they're pretty passionate about this being a valid a valid opportunity to help our churches get the resources they need to educate the people that, if they come into different roles, and ultimately to have a tool that can help keep children and those who are most vulnerable safe, so that we eventually drive towards an environment where we're abuse free throughout all churches who affiliate voluntarily with the SBC. I mean, that's the goal. So
right. Well, and understand that's a pretty difficult attainable goal, but obviously, we would want that to be the case. And
yes, sir.
The resourcing for sure is something that many churches have not taken advantage of from other sources. I mean, there have been sources available, all over, that churches could have taken advantage of, but many of them haven't. And some of it goes back to choices churches have made related to
that's right.
The whole issue of abuse and that kind of thing. Well, John, thank you so much for joining us and being a part today. Help us to see some of the financial issues that are going on with the SBC, and then the other. We're going to try to keep everybody updated on that, and I appreciate your honesty joining us today with that.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks very much for having me. And anything I can do to help, just let me know.
All right. Thank you.